Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question about America's elections. What would Lincoln do? Let's get to the bottom line. U.S. President Donald Trump set off alarm bells in America last week when he talked about delaying the upcoming election. After the coronavirus pandemic, public health officials recommended that people avoid long lines at polling stations and mail their ballots in instead. But Trump and his juggernaut media machine have been relentless in discounting the credibility of mailed-in ballots, climaxing in a tweet last week where he floated the idea of actually delaying Elections Day, which is set for November 3rd. That idea was quickly killed by the White House, but the fears remain, especially after he said that he'll wait and see if he accepts the election results. Today, we're joined by someone who's been involved in American politics for decades. Sidney Blumenthal is a veteran journalist who's worked with leading publications like the New York Times, the New Republic, and the Guardian. And he's an author who's writing a landmark series of books on the life and times of America's 16th president, President Abraham Lincoln. Sid, it's great to be with you. And I, as you know, have been reading your books. But I want to start the show with a sound clip from President Trump.
Republicans are the party of liberty, equality, and justice for all. We are the party of Abraham Lincoln, and we are the party of law and order.
So, Sidney, President Trump often mentions President Lincoln, compares himself to President Lincoln, says that he is doing better in the polls than President Lincoln. And I just want to get your dashboard of the comparison between Lincoln in his time and President Trump's depiction of Abraham Lincoln.
Donald Trump, as far as I know, has never read a single biography of any president. He has no idea who Abraham Lincoln was and what his legacy is, because Donald Trump is somebody who has systematically stepped all over and destroyed Lincoln's legacy. Lately, he's been stepping all over Trump's legacy, Lincoln's legacy, involving questioning holding an election itself. Lincoln in 1864 faced his reelection. As he said to a friend, "I'm going to be beaten and beaten badly." General Grant's offensive had ground down into a standstill in the trenches outside of Richmond. There were enormous casualties, unheard of casualties. And Lincoln was deeply unpopular. There seemed to be nothing that could rescue him. All of his advisors suggested that he would lose. And Lincoln said that not to hold an election would be to be the greatest defeat of all and lead to the entire ruin of the idea for which we are fighting, the idea of democracy. But for Trump, everything is about Donald Trump. For Lincoln, in his humility, his sense of a greater cause, and his patriotism, the Union itself was what he was willing and did, in fact, lay down his life.
So, when you've written about Lincoln and those times, you can feel the tension that if there was a moment in American history when democracy was truly threatened, when institutions might not have worked, it was then. Today, given what you've looked at in that period of history, do you feel that we're going through that process again? And do you worry about democracy in this country and the inability of our institutions in the United States to check the power of a president who has taken and amassed so much power?
Well, obviously the reason for the Civil War, which was the greatest crisis in our country's history, was slavery. And what happened was that the Slave South had become a political minority in controlling the federal government. And what triggered secession and the Civil War was Lincoln's election in 1860. For the first time, an anti-slavery president elected who would hold federal power and use that office to put slavery, as Lincoln said, on the course of ultimate extinction. And so South Carolina led the South in seceding. They were a minority. And we face the same problem today, the flouting of majority rule, of majority will, of democracy. If Donald Trump thinks that as receiving a minority of the votes, he can thwart the popular will in some way by discrediting mail-in ballots or this, that, or the other thing, and render the very process of democracy illegitimate, then he is in some way on a continuum with what the Confederacy did in breaking up the Union and precipitating the Civil War, our greatest crisis.
One of the wonderful vignettes that I got from your book was a letter that Abraham Lincoln wrote to his friend. And I'd like to read this vignette because just as you talked about those circumstances then, there are eerie similarities to today. And Lincoln wrote, "I am not a know-nothing, that is certain. How could I be? How can anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of degrading classes of white people? Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we begin by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. And when the know-nothings get control, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy." I read this and got goosebumps because I sort of thought, wow, this could have been written yesterday.
Well, the Know Nothing Party was a nativist anti-immigrant party that had come into being and was a very powerful third party after the breakup of the Whig Party. Lincoln had been a stalwart Whig his whole life, but his party disintegrated beneath his feet. The Know-Nothings grew up. There was not yet a Republican Party when he wrote that letter. Lincoln created the Illinois Republican Party. Just to unpack that little letter, the Declaration of Independence, with its key phrase, all men are created equal, as the very basis, foundation of his politics. He also believed that the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, was very much part of the Constitution in his view. He loathed the Know-Nothings and their nativism. And this party grew up in the aftermath of the 1848 waves of immigration of Irish and Germans to the United States. So there was not even a racial element to it. It was just pure anti-immigrant. Eventually, Lincoln defeated the Know-Nothing Party through the creation of the Republican Party and assimilated parts of it to the Republican Party in a different cause against preserving the Union and then against slavery. But he faced many of these same forces that are still out there today. And Trump has taken up the banner of the Know-Nothings that Lincoln fought against.
Well, I know that this is an unfair question, but you and I have been in this town in Washington for a long time. I've met President Trump before he was president. You no doubt have been in rooms with him in this crowd. And I guess my question is, what conditions did he experience that made him the leader of such a populist movement in this time?
Well, Trump took advantage of a vacuum in the Republican Party after after the Bush presidency and the Iraq War and the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and Jeb Bush, who was the legatee, the heir to that party, Trump pushed aside. That party had sort of ceased to exist, and Trump appealed to base instincts that had always been there in the country, without the dog whistle, without the code words. And what appealed to those people was precisely the harshness and roughness of it against what they perceived as cosmopolitan elites who they hated. All of this goes back to the transformation and radicalization of the Republican Party, a process of decades that went back to its co-optation of the constituency and campaign of George Wallace in the 1960s and early 1970s, when he ran racist campaigns, and the Southern strategy to co-opt that movement into the Republican Party led to its being, in effect, taken over by it. And now, ironically, in a way, this New York real estate failure, a bankrupt, who is nothing but a veneer of faux success, has taken over essentially what is at base a modernized Dixiecrat party. And there we are in the continuity of American history all the way back to Lincoln.
That's a big flip-flop from where Lincoln launched the party and where it is today. Sid, where do you think that this is going? You watch President Trump, and you wrote a powerful op-ed about this moment in the Washington Post about elections and about what Lincoln would really do. And you know, how dire a situation do you see this moment?
It could be a very dire situation. We're going to find out. We're on the brink of possible catastrophe or a rescue. Trump has made it clear that he will do anything to disrupt the election. Trump can never win a popular vote. He is the only president since modern polling has existed who's never reached 50%. He's the most unpopular president in recent American history. And he can never win a popular vote. So he has to win on an inside straight, on a freakish distribution of votes in swing states like he did last time through, the pressure of certain external events, many of which don't exist now. So he has to challenge the very idea of a fair election, and has created the idea that it will necessarily be rigged if he loses, and create that idea in his followers' minds, so that even if he does lose, he may throw the election into uncertainty and play it out from there. We've never really been in this dire a situation, potentially. We've had contested elections before, but they always worked out, and everyone accepted the result. We may not be there this time.
Sid, we have three, what I've been calling tsunamis hitting America at the same time. A pandemic that's horrific, that's killed more than 150,000 Americans and is growing by the day. Infection rates that are among the worst in the world now. An economic crisis with 54 million people officially unemployed. And of course, we have a racial crisis, a racial divide on inequality and police brutality in this country. And so this is a very toxic environment. And Donald Trump has felt that he has the right to deploy federal forces out to pick people off the street. And perhaps this is an unfair question, but if Trump is seeing America in total crisis and taking extraordinary powers to intervene, is there any similarity to Lincoln in a time of crisis and a dark side? Was there a dark side of Lincoln in responding to some of that might be similar to President Trump?
Well, William Barr, who is Donald Trump's attorney general, may well be the mastermind behind the creation of a novel federal kind of police force or military operation that we saw in Lafayette Square and then deployed in Portland. Is this a run-up to an election in which there is a disruption by Trump? He doesn't accept the result, and there is violence, and somehow an insurrection act is invoked and Barr deploys forces, and all of this to prevent some sort of resolution against Trump. Let's hope we don't get there. Lincoln faced a very explicit, open political, break in secession, and the first shot, of course, had been fired by the Confederates at Fort Sumter, so that they were the aggressor in what people thought would be a short war and turned into the bloodiest and a very prolonged conflict, and very different from what we face today. And when Lincoln lifted habeas corpus, he did so under legal strictures when the Congress was in recess and couldn't uphold it, and he waited till they came back and then they approved it, and so on. And what you were dealing with was, in fact, an insurrection. And what was the insurrection against? It was against democracy, against accepting democracy, against the very heart and constitution of the United States of America. And the question is whether Trump will engage in that sort of activity, a kind of counter-revolution against constitutional democracy as we go forward.
Part of that pathway will be his relationship with the media, which, to be kind, I would say is a bit stressed. And I'd love to hear about Lincoln's relationship with the media.
Well, Lincoln had deep and close relations with the media of his time, and even before. Lincoln, in effect, was the kind of editor of the newspaper in Springfield, Illinois, which was the leading newspaper in the state. It was the Illinois State Journal. And he wrote hundreds of editorials anonymously. We don't know all of those he wrote, and there are historians to this day trying to figure out which ones he wrote. He had a deep, close personal relations with many journalists, with editors. They were complicated. During the war, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton shut down 2 newspapers at one point, and Lincoln overrode them. And those were newspapers that were anti-Lincoln, very harsh. And Lincoln allowed the nastiest kind of opposition, most racist invective to be published. It was not, he didn't feel it was his privilege or right to stop that sort of thing. Donald Trump has declared the press the enemy of the people, and he's acting on it. And we'll see how that plays out as we move closer to the election, and how he attempts to restrict the press as part of his desperate strategy to retain power.
I mean, given all that you have been around in American politics, how do you bet this is going to turn out, Sidney? I mean, when you watch what Donald Trump is doing and how he's approaching this election, you look at how Biden is building his campaign, and you've witnessed so many Democratic campaigns. Just what's your bet about how it's going to unfold?
I hate to be a predictor, but my view is that Biden will certainly win the popular vote by a lot and win the electoral college vote, and Trump will attempt to disrupt it. But let's take those 3 crises that you raised before: the pandemic, the economic crisis, and the racial crisis, or as Trump calls it, a crisis of law and order. And let's think about those in his terms. We had a pandemic, the Spanish flu, in 1918, 1919. And what did that lead to? It led to a new president, Warren G. Harding, the country demanding, as his slogan went, a return to normalcy. sense of stability and steadiness after World War I and going through the trauma of that pandemic at the same time. The economic crisis, we went through the Depression, the economic depression. The amount of unemployment that we will enter this election with is comparable to the unemployment numbers of the first few years of the Great Depression of the early 30s. And the Republicans who had held the Congress for a long period of time were overthrown in 1930 in a wipeout, an upheaval, a landslide that presaged Franklin Delano Roosevelt's great victory in 1932. And then the third crisis, the racial crisis. We had a racial crisis and a crisis of law and order in the late 1960s. Lyndon Johnson was the incumbent president, a Democrat, and he was the one who paid the price, and so did the Democratic Party for all the upheaval. And now Trump is the incumbent, and he's attempting to escape his responsibility, famously saying about the pandemic, "I don't take any responsibility at all." But with that and law and order and the Portland incident, it's reminiscent, especially the Lafayette Square incident. It's reminiscent to me of nothing so much as what Herbert Hoover did in 1932, when unemployed veterans came to Washington and camped out along the Anacostia and Potomac rivers in tents, and Hoover sent the U.S. Army to disperse them. It was deeply unpopular, military against America, and that's what Trump has done. So he has compounded all of these crises, and he bears the burden of all of these, and the historical examples all run against him. So I believe he will lose overwhelmingly, and that will be the judgment of people. And he is attempting to defy it through desperate gambits right.
I have learned from you that Abraham Lincoln was America's first professional politician. And that is one of the fascinating things about the set of books that you've written about his life. And I'd just like to take Lincoln as president away for a moment and look at President Lincoln, the campaigner. If he were running in the unlikely historical matchup against President Trump, what would Lincoln be doing right now?
He would be a master politician in dealing with Trump and all of his crises. But he was something more. He was the most eloquent president we have ever had. And he wrote his own speeches. And he would be able to describe the crisis that we are going through today as he described the fiery trial, as he called it, that Americans went through in the Civil War.
Well, we will end it there. Sidney Blumenthal, writer, author, chronicler of the life, times and ideas of Abraham Lincoln. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing with us what Lincoln would do today. Fascinating.
Thank you so much, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? Trump's opponents paint his rants about mail-in ballots as another dose of voter suppression and a personal insecurity that he doesn't believe he can actually win a popular vote, as our guest said today. But my political science professor taught me that you don't really know the true values of a society unless you see it under stress. And right now, America is really under a lot of stress. There is a constitution, and the election is supposed to take place on November 3rd and probably will. But Abraham Lincoln, whom Trump compares himself to constantly, would have made absolutely sure that the election was held. And the fact that we are struggling over this today shows us just how much has changed. And that's the bottom line.